I've spent years collecting accounts from people who spent decades working as caretakers, groundskeepers, and property managers for large, old estates, people whose jobs put them in intimate, long-term contact with buildings and grounds that carry considerably more history than any brief visitor could ever properly appreciate. This is one of those accounts, shared with me by a woman named Diane Foss, whose father spent nearly 40 years as the sole caretaker for a large, remote estate in rural New England, and who told her, near the end of his life, about an experience involving an old well on that property that he had kept almost entirely secret for decades. If stories like this are the reason you're here, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because I put out a new one every week, and this is one of the most quietly unsettling accounts I have ever brought to this channel. Alright, let's begin. Part 1. Meeting Diane. I met Diane Foss roughly 2 years ago, connected through a mutual acquaintance after she reached out to me directly, having followed this channel for some time and feeling, as she put it in her initial message, that her father's story finally deserved to be properly told, now that both her father and the family who had owned the estate where he worked had passed on, removing what she described as her own long-standing hesitation about sharing an account that had remained almost entirely private within her own family for decades. Diane's father, a man named Walter Foss, worked as the sole live-in caretaker for a large, remote estate in rural New England from 1961 until his retirement in 1999, a property that had been in the same family for well over a century before Walter's tenure began, and which included, among its considerable grounds, a large main house, several outbuildings, and an old, hand-dug well situated a short distance behind the main residence, a well that, as far as Diane was aware from her father's own account, had gone unused for practical water collection purposes for decades before his own arrival, the estate having long since been connected to modern plumbing and water systems. Diane told me her father rarely discussed his work in any great detail throughout her childhood and early adult life, maintaining, she said, a considerable professional discretion regarding the family he worked for and the daily particulars of his caretaking responsibilities that she had always simply accepted as part of his generally quiet, private personality. It was only in the final 2 years of his life, as his health began seriously declining, that he finally shared with her the account I'm about to share with you, an account she described as fundamentally changing her entire understanding of her father and of the seemingly ordinary, quiet decades he had spent maintaining that remote estate. Part 2. The well. Diane told me her father's account began with a detailed description of the old well itself, a hand-dug structure that, according to what he had been able to determine through the estate's own surviving records, predated the main house's construction by at least several decades, suggesting the well had originally served an earlier, considerably more modest structure on the same property before the current main house was eventually built nearby, incorporating and continuing to maintain the older, well, rather than constructing an entirely new one. She described her father telling her that throughout the majority of his tenure at the estate, the well had remained a largely unremarkable, if slightly unusual, feature of the property, covered by a heavy wooden platform and surrounded by a low stone wall that the estate's owning family maintained primarily for aesthetic and historical preservation purposes rather than any practical, ongoing use. Walter's own caretaking duties, according to Diane's account, included only occasional, routine maintenance of the well's exterior stonework and covering, work he had performed without particular incident or concern for well over 2 decades of his tenure. Diane told me her father's account described a fundamental shift in his own understanding and treatment of the well beginning in the early 1980s, prompted by an incident involving the estate's elderly former caretaker, a man Walter had briefly overlapped with and trained under during his own initial hiring in 1961, a man who had himself served as caretaker for the estate for several decades prior to Walter's own tenure, and who had, by the early 1980s, long since retired but remained in occasional, informal contact with Walter and with the estate's owning family. If this story is already unsettling you, and I hope it is, now's a good time to subscribe, because what that elderly former caretaker eventually shared with Walter, and what Walter himself subsequently experienced, forms the core of one of the most quietly disturbing accounts I have personally encountered. Alright, let's continue. Part 3. The former caretaker's warning. Diane described her father recounting a visit from this elderly former caretaker, a man named Elias Corbin, sometime in early 1982, prompted, according to Walter's own account, by Corbin having heard, through his continued informal contact with the estate's owning family, that Walter had recently begun a more extensive renovation and restoration project on several of the estate's older outbuildings. Work that, as part of its broader scope, included plans to properly restore and reinforce the old well stonework, which had begun showing genuine signs of age-related deterioration by that point. Diane told me her father described Corbin arriving at the estate specifically, urgently, to discuss this planned well restoration work, displaying a level of genuine concern and insistence that Walter found immediately considerably unusual given the elderly man's generally calm, reserved temperament throughout their previous years of occasional, friendly contact. She described her father recounting Corbin's specific warning, delivered during a private conversation the two men had, away from the main house. A warning that Corbin apparently prefaced by explaining that he had never previously felt it necessary or appropriate to share this particular piece of information, given that the well had remained, throughout his own decades of tenure, safely sealed and undisturbed, but that Walter's planned restoration work, involving direct physical work on the well structure, had prompted him to finally break his own decades-long silence on the matter. Diane described her father recounting Corbin's warning as centering on a specific, unusual phrase that Corbin apparently repeated several times throughout their conversation, insisting that wells, in his own careful, considered understanding developed across his own decades of caretaking experience at that specific property, were never built to hold water, a phrase that Walter initially found genuinely puzzling, given the obvious, conventional practical purpose of any well, before Corbin explained, with evident difficulty and considerable reluctance even in that private conversation, precisely what he meant by that unusual, deliberately chosen framing. Part 4. Corbin's account. Diane told me her father recounted Corbin explaining that during his own early years as the estate's caretaker, sometime in the 1940s, he had experienced a series of unsettling incidents connected directly to the well, incidents that had ultimately led him to take the specific precautionary measures that had kept the well safely, permanently sealed throughout the remainder of his own decades-long tenure. Measures he had apparently maintained without ever fully explaining their true underlying purpose to the estate's owning family, who had simply accepted, over the years, his professional recommendation that the well remain covered and undisturbed as a matter of routine safety practice. Diane described her father recounting Corbin's explanation of these original incidents, describing a period during his early tenure when he began noticing unusual sounds emanating from the well during certain nights, sounds that he struggled, even decades later in recounting the experience to Walter, to properly characterize, beyond describing something that began as a faint, difficult-to-source echoing, gradually intensifying, over a period of several weeks, into what he became increasingly convinced represented distinct, if severely distorted, human vocalization, carrying qualities of distress, and, more disturbingly according to Corbin's account, an unsettling, persistent quality of direct, deliberate address, as though whatever was producing the sounds was attempting genuine, specific communication rather than simply producing random, ambient noise. Diane told me her father recounted Corbin describing his own initial, cautious investigation of these sounds, approaching the well directly during one particularly disturbing nighttime episode, and experiencing, upon close approach, an immediate, overwhelming sense of wrongness that he found himself entirely unable to properly rationalize or dismiss, despite his own generally practical, grounded temperament and his considerable skepticism, at the time, regarding anything resembling genuinely supernatural phenomena. If you're still with me, this is genuinely the part of the story where it gets considerably more unsettling. And I do want to say, one more time, subscribe now if you haven't, because what Corbin ultimately told Walter about his own direct experience at that well is something Walter apparently carried, in careful, guarded silence, for the remainder of his own decades-long tenure at that same property. All right, let's continue. Part 5. What Corbin experienced. Diane described her father recounting Corbin's most detailed and disturbing account, describing a specific night when the unsettling vocalizations from the well grew considerably more intense and considerably more clearly, unmistakably directed specifically at him, calling out, according to Corbin's own careful recollection, using a voice that he became absolutely convinced, despite every rational effort to doubt his own perception, belonged unmistakably to his own younger brother, a man who had, in fact, passed away several years earlier, well before Corbin had ever taken up his position as the estate's caretaker. Diane told me her father recounted Corbin describing the voice as pleading with him to look down into the well, insisting, with what Corbin characterized as genuine, desperate urgency, that he was trapped there and required immediate assistance, a plea that Corbin admitted, even decades later, had come remarkably close to overriding his own considerable, instinctive unease, driven by the powerful, immediate emotional pull of believing, even briefly, that his own deceased brother might genuinely require his help. She described her father recounting Corbin's account of ultimately resisting this powerful compulsion, driven by a final, critical detail that had struck him, even in the emotional intensity of that moment, as fundamentally, unmistakably wrong. A specific verbal mannerism the voice used that Corbin knew, with absolute certainty, his actual brother had never once used throughout his entire life. A small but decisive inconsistency that allowed Corbin to recognize, in that critical moment, that he was dealing with something other than any genuine manifestation of his actual deceased brother, however convincing and however emotionally powerful the deception had otherwise been. Diane told me her father recounted Corbin describing his immediate retreat from the well following this realization, and his subsequent, urgent decision to have the well permanently sealed, a decision he implemented within days, using considerably more substantial covering and sealing materials than the well's previous, more casual wooden platform had provided. Work that Corbin apparently completed with minimal explanation to the estate's owning family at the time, framing it simply as a reasonable safety precaution rather than revealing the actual, deeply unsettling experience that had genuinely motivated his urgent action. Part 6. Walter's decision. Diane described her father recounting his own reaction to Corbin's extensive, deeply unsettling account, describing a mixture of considerable skepticism, given his own decades of entirely uneventful experience with the well throughout his tenure up to that point, and a growing, difficult to fully dismiss unease, driven primarily by his own considerable respect for Corbin's generally practical, grounded character and professional judgment, developed across their years of occasional but consistently positive interaction. She told me her father ultimately made the decision to proceed with considerably greater caution regarding his planned restoration work than he had originally intended, choosing to conduct the work during full daylight hours, with additional assistance from hired local laborers rather than working alone, as he had originally planned, and maintaining, throughout the project, a heightened, careful attention to Corbin's specific warnings, despite his own continued, private uncertainty regarding whether he genuinely believed the full extent of what the elderly former caretaker had described. Diane described her father's restoration work proceeding, for the first several days, entirely without incident, reinforcing and repairing the well's exterior stonework according to his original planned scope of work, and she told me he had, by the third day of the project, begun to genuinely believe that Corbin's account, whatever its underlying basis, likely reflected some combination of decades-old psychological stress and the isolating effects of extended solitary caretaking work, rather than any genuine, ongoing supernatural phenomenon he personally needed to remain seriously concerned about. It was on the fourth night following the beginning of his restoration work, according to Diane's account of her father's own careful recollection, that Walter experienced something that fundamentally, permanently altered his own private assessment of Corbin's original warning. If this story is getting to you the way I hope it is, subscribe now, because I need to tell you what Walter himself directly experienced, and about the decision he ultimately made regarding the well's final fate, which he apparently maintained, in careful secrecy, for the remainder of his own decades-long tenure at that same estate. All right, let's finish this. Part 7. Walter's own experience. Diane told me her father described waking, sometime in the deep hours of that fourth night, to a sound that immediately, unmistakably matched the general character Corbin had described years earlier, a faint, distant echoing carrying up from the direction of the well, which remained, at that point in his restoration work, only partially resealed with its more substantial covering not yet fully completed. She described her father recounting his own careful, cautious approach toward the well, driven by a combination of professional obligation, given his responsibility for the ongoing restoration project, and a growing, difficult to fully suppress curiosity regarding whether he might genuinely be about to experience something matching Corbin's extensive account. Diane told me her father described the sound gradually, disturbingly resolving, as he drew closer to the well's edge, into what he became genuinely, immediately convinced represented distinct, clearly articulated speech, though he was careful, even in recounting the experience to Diane decades later, to note his own persistent uncertainty regarding whose voice, specifically, he believed he was hearing during that particular experience. Diane described her father recounting the voice as employing a similar pattern to what Corbin had originally described, expressing distress and urgent pleading for assistance, though Walter, according to Diane's account, described his own experience as involving a voice he was unable to specifically, confidently attribute to any particular deceased individual from his own personal life, a detail that struck him, even in the unsettling immediacy of the actual moment, as somewhat different from Corbin's own account of clearly, specifically recognizing his brother's voice. She told me her father described maintaining, throughout this direct experience, a careful, deliberate skepticism informed directly by Corbin's earlier warning, actively searching, as he listened, for any of the kind of small, decisive inconsistencies that had ultimately allowed Corbin to recognize the deceptive nature of his own earlier experience, and that Walter believed, in retrospect, he did indeed notice several such inconsistencies, subtle but persistent qualities to the voice's phrasing, and emotional tenor that struck him, even in the moment, as carrying an unmistakable, difficult to properly articulate wrongness beneath its surface, desperate plausibility. Part 8. The Ceiling. Diane described her father recounting his decision, made in the immediate aftermath of that direct experience, to abandon any further consideration of continuing his originally planned restoration work in any capacity that would leave the well more accessible or more visually prominent than its previous, decades-long covered condition. She told me he described spending the remainder of that same night, and the following full day, working largely alone, constructing and installing a considerably more substantial, permanent ceiling structure than either his own originally planned restoration or Corbin's earlier, more modest covering had ever provided. She described her father explaining this sudden shift in his approach to the estate's owning family and to his hired local laborers using a similarly modest, practical framing to what Corbin had apparently employed decades earlier, describing the more substantial ceiling work as a reasonable, prudent safety measure given the well's evident structural age and deterioration, rather than revealing his own genuine, direct experience or Corbin's earlier, considerably more detailed account. Diane told me her father maintained this permanent ceiling throughout the remainder of his own nearly two-decade tenure at the estate following that 1982 incident, and that he described never again experiencing any further incidents or sounds connected to the well throughout the remainder of his time working that property, a fact he attributed, with evident, considerable personal conviction, to the effectiveness of his own more substantial ceiling work, though he acknowledged to Diane, near the end of his life, his own persistent, lasting uncertainty regarding whether that ceiling had genuinely resolved whatever underlying phenomenon he and Corbin had both directly experienced, or whether it had simply, temporarily satisfied him personally, without necessarily addressing whatever deeper, underlying cause had originally produced those unsettling experiences in the first place. Part 9. Why Walter finally told Diane. I asked Diane, during our own extensive conversation, why her father had ultimately decided to share this account with her, after apparently maintaining careful silence regarding the experience throughout the vast majority of his adult life and his entire lengthy tenure at the estate. She told me her father explained his decision, near the end of his own life, as being driven by a combination of his own advancing health concerns, prompting a natural, human desire to properly share and preserve significant experiences before it became too late to do so, and a specific, considered concern regarding the Wells' continued fate following the eventual sale of the estate, which had occurred several years after Walter's own 1999 retirement, once the elderly owning family's own final surviving members had passed away. Diane told me her father expressed considerable, genuine concern that whatever new owners eventually took possession of the property might, at some future point, decide to remove or disturb his own careful, permanent sealing work, lacking any awareness whatsoever of the specific, considered reasoning that had originally motivated it, and that he wanted, at minimum, for his own family to properly understand and, if ever genuinely necessary, be equipped to explain the Wells' true history and significance, should that knowledge ever become practically relevant in the future. Part 10. Closing Thoughts. I've shared Diane Foss's account of her father's experience as completely and as faithfully as our extensive conversation allows, drawing on her own careful, detailed recollection of what her father shared with her during the final years of his life. I want to be honest with you that this account, like many of the most compelling stories I bring to this channel, ultimately rests on secondhand, if evidently sincere and carefully preserved, family testimony, rather than any independently verifiable documentation or corroborating evidence beyond Diane's own genuine, considerable conviction regarding her father's honesty and reliability as a source.
I want to close by sharing Diane's own final reflection, offered near the end of our conversation, on what her father's account had ultimately taught her about a man she had, throughout most of her life, regarded as simply quiet, private, and entirely ordinary. She told me she had come to understand, through finally learning this account during the final years of his life, that her father had spent nearly 4 decades of his working life carrying a genuine, considerable private burden, carefully, deliberately protecting both the estate's owning family and, ultimately, his own family from a truth he had determined, through his own careful judgment, was better carried quietly and responsibly than shared or sensationalized, a decision she had come to deeply respect, even as she ultimately decided, following both her father's and the owning family's passing, that the account itself finally deserved to be properly, respectfully shared. That's the story of the old caretaker who came to believe that wells were never built to hold water, and who spent decades quietly, carefully ensuring that whatever the well behind that remote New England estate was actually built to contain remained safely, permanently sealed. It's shared as completely and as faithfully as Diane Foss's own careful recollection of her father's account allows, and it remains, even now, one of the most quietly unsettling first-hand family accounts I have ever brought to this channel. If this one kept you up, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I put out a new story just like this one every single week, and I would genuinely hate for you to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you believe Walter and Corbin genuinely experienced something authentically supernatural at that well, or whether you believe, as some skeptics inevitably will, that decades of isolated, solitary caretaking work in a genuinely remote setting can produce this kind of vivid, persistent, and ultimately shared experience across 2 entirely separate individuals working the same property decades apart. Thank you for listening. And if you ever come across an old, covered well on a property with a long, layered history, and someone who's worked that property for decades tells you, quietly and with evident sincerity, that it's better left exactly as it is, I hope you remember Walter and Corbin's story, and I hope you trust that quiet, careful warning considerably more than your own passing curiosity.